Hey guys, and welcome to another Mammoth Interactive tutorial on elements of the Swift 3 programming language. So we're in Xcode right now, and I've just opened up a new playground file, and so we're going to use this playground just to kind of teach you about for in loops, and that's going to be the focus of this tutorial. It's going to be for in loops. So this is just a way to kind of iterate through a certain section of code. So we'll have some code between some curly braces, and we'll just execute this code with each iteration, and we'll do this many times as is specified. So loops are great for executing the same code as many times as we want without having to explicitly say, execute it this many times. So they look a little like this. So we'll have a for, and then we have a Swift for statement for item in items. So basically we have usually some kind of an index, and then usually it's some kind of an index maximum or minimum followed by a maximum. So let's say from 0 ... and then let's just say, actually let's not give these real values, we'll just say min ... max. Okay, and then this will just be code to execute with each loop iteration. Okay, and I'll go into more detail. I'm just going to explain a little bit more about what a for in loop is. So for in loops are useful for executing the same code specified within the loop as many times as we tell the loop to run it. Okay, so basically it's a great way to perform the same task over and over again without having to call that particular piece of code or that particular line of code. We can just put it in this loop, tell it how many times to execute, and it will execute it. This is great for accessing elements in arrays, or if we want to, just any task that we want to perform multiple times. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about how it's set up. So we have this for in, and then the body of the code in here. So this is usually some kind of an indexing variable. And for in loops, the indexing variable is an integer type, and it will start at the value we specify. It will start at this minimum value, and it will run until the maximum value, increasing by 1 each time. Okay, so I'm just going to say that in here. So index is an int. That, in fact, let's use proper capitalization. So index is an int that starts at the min value, increases by 1 with each loop iteration, and the loop stops running once the index, we'll leave it lowercase, once the index reaches the max value. Okay. Oh, I guess it should be ... actually. There we go. So basically what this will do is indexes starting at minimum. Each time the loop iterates, it will increase by 1, and it will run up until it reaches maximum value. So let's say this is a 0 and this is a 4. It will run, so the first iteration index is 0, second it's 1, third it's 2, the fourth it's 3, and the fifth iteration it's 4. And once that fifth iteration executes, then it will exit the loop. Okay, so it will only run this code as many times as we specify in here. So usually we start at a 0 or a 1. With some of the for loops in other languages, we could actually start at a high value and count down. That's just not what we can do with this for in loop. Okay, so again, it has this indexing variable, starts at the minimum value, runs until the maximum value, and this is maximum value inclusive, this is maximum value exclusive, so it will exit before it reaches the max value. Okay, so we're going to explain a little bit more about them. It's actually easier to understand how these loops work if you watch them in action with a real example, and then you can actually see each value increasing, or you can see the work being done with each iteration. Okay, so again, just another great way to execute this code as many times as we specify, just by calling it once rather than having to call it many times. Okay, so those are for in loops for you. Again, really useful elements of any language really. You'll see for loops in most coding languages. So yeah, pay close attention. They're going to be really useful. You're gonna love for in loops by the end of it. Okay, so I hope you guys learn a lot and hope you guys enjoy this tutorial. Alright, so now we're going to see a for in loop in action. Okay, so we're going to first compare it to a for loop that's seen in other languages. So for those of you who are familiar with for loops, it's going to work pretty much the same, but there are a few different kind of restrictions that we have with a for in loop that we didn't have with the for loop. However, this also makes it a little easier to understand. So I'm just going to show you how it works. We're going to demonstrate this for in loop using this variable count, which will just increase by 1 with each iteration of the loop, and then we'll see how it changes. Alright, so now we've seen what a basic for in loop looks like. Let's see one actually working. And the way I'm going to show this to you is I'm going to compare it to a regular for loop, so that for those of you who've seen a for loop before, it'll be a lot more obvious how the for in loop works. Now I find it personally easier to understand a for loop rather than the new for in loop, so that's why I feel like it's a good tool to be able to compare the two. Okay, so I'm just going to put this in a comment. The old for loop looks a little like this. So we'd have kind of like an int I equals 0, we'd have an I less than, let's just say 5 for now, and then an I plus plus. And basically this is saying that the indexing is starting at 0, it's going to stop once the indexing reaches 5, and it's going to increase by 1 each time, okay? So each time the loop iterates, it will increase I by 1, and the first run through with the loop, I is going to be equal to 0, and the last time it runs will be when I is 4, because when I is 5, then the loop exits, which is why we have I less than 5. Okay? Whereas a for in loop, for the same thing, would look like this. So let's say we have some kind of, we could say I, if we want, in 0.5. Okay? And this is doing exactly the same thing as we see this for loop doing up here. So we have an I, which is going to be an integer, which represents the index, same as up here. We're starting at 0, which is here, and we're running until 5, which we show here. Now, the big difference is that we have the I++ here, specifying that our indexing is increasing by 1 each time. We could also change this to something like I equals I plus 2, if we want to increase the indexing by 2 each time. Okay? Unfortunately, with for in loops, that's not really something we can do. We kind of have to increase by 1 each time. Okay? So the way we would increase by more than 1 each time is by using a while loop and then having some kind of count variable that increases by 2 each time, but that's a different topic. For now, just recognize that for in loops start at this value, then there's the 3 dots, and then this is the value they end at, and this is the indexing variable, and they're always increasing count by 1, okay? So that's how it works. One other thing to note is that this for loop, the old for loop, will stop because we specified when I is less than 5. That means the loop exits on the 6th iteration, so the loop only runs 5 times. However, for this kind of for loop, the for in loop, it will run 6 times because it will run for 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so that's 6 numbers in total, whereas this one would only run for 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then it would exit. Okay, so that's another difference. So the way we're going to demonstrate this for loop in action is I'm just going to write a comment here, so runs for, and this runs for. Okay, so I'm just going to create a simple count variable, so I'm just going to call this variable count, I'll give it type int, and let's just give it the value of 0 to start off with. Okay, and all we want to do is we want to increase the value of count 1 time per iteration. Okay, so all we're going to do is we're simply going to say count plus plus, and again, just for those of you who haven't seen the plus plus operator, oh, and in fact it's not even going to let me here, we'll just say count equals count plus 1. Now another way we can do this is we can do this, we could say count plus equals 1. Okay, and that's doing the same thing as what we had before, count plus 1, because this is saying count equals, or count equals whatever count was before plus 1, okay? And yeah, so same as there. I'm just going to use a short form because it only saves a little bit of time, but when it does, you know, when you have to write these kind of things out 100 times, it really adds up. So this is saying 6 times, and that's because the loop is running 6 times, remember? So it's starting at 0, it's running through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and yeah, so it's from 0 to 5, okay, rather than 0 to 4 here. So what should our result be? Well, each time this loop iterates, we're just going to increase count by 1. So if it's iterating 6 times and count starts at 0, we should have the value of 6. So let's just have count here, and there we go. We do indeed get the value of 6 because this loop is running 6 times, remember, 0 to 5, and each time it's just increasing count by 1. Okay, so we don't actually use this indexing variable in this particular for loop. That's just to specify that there is an index. We're just calling it I because we could use it within the loop, but in this particular instance we're not. Okay, so just to refresh, this is the same thing as saying count is count plus 1 for each iteration, and it's running 6 times, so basically just saying count equals count plus 1 6 times, so count equals a total of 6. Okay, so again, running 6 times, starting at 0, running until 5, and the indexing variable is I, and of course we're increasing just by 1 each time because that's how for-in loops work. Okay, so this is just a basic example of a for-in loop, and we were just increasing count by 1 each time. This next part coming up will actually look to use the indexing variable, and it might become more clear exactly what's going on within these loops. Right, in this part of the tutorial we just saw a for-in loop in action. So what we did is we created a simple loop that was just supposed to increase a variable which we called count by 1 with each iteration. So each time it ran, it just increased count, took the current value of count and increased it by 1. Okay, so each time it runs we're adding 1 to count. So we ran this loop 6 times, we started at 0 and ran to 5, so count ends up being 6 at the end. Okay, now this was one of the big differences that we saw with for-in loops and for loops, is that with for loops we would specify it starts at 0 and ends when I is less than 5, so that would actually only run it would run 5 times rather than 6 because 0 through 4 and then would exit on the 5th count, whereas with the for-in loop it starts from 0 and runs all the way until 5 and then exits, so it actually runs 6 times, so we get the count ending up being 6 at the very end.